good day there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the typewriter video series. Well, we have the Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter, the newest machine to my collection that I've named Adobe Rose, from the color, obviously. And we have our little nicely decorative howling coyote, which I think is appropriate. So last week I had a late lunch and I didn't feel like having dinner at the normal time. My wife went ahead and had her dinner. And then later in the evening, approximately 8:26 p.m. to be exact, I got hungry and I rode my motor scooter down to the Whataburger that's in my neighborhood, the hamburger chain that you might be familiar with in some parts of the U.S. And I got myself a little dinner, which was a fish sandwich and onion rings, in case you're interested. But they gave me a receipt, obviously, on this 3 1/8 inch wide thermal paper. I got home, I ate my dinner, and then I started looking at this thermal paper. I noticed, first of all, the quality of the imprint in the middle of the paper was less than optimal. Apparently their thermal printing heads, maybe on their cash register, need to be cleaned or something. But I've had a lot of these receipts in the past. But the first thing I noticed was, hey, this paper is a little wider than the standard 2 1/4 inch width receipts that you get from a lot of stores. And then that's when I decided, hey, I've never really tried typing on thermal paper. And I wouldn't want to type on the chemical side, the front side that turns dark with either pressure or temperature. But I figured, let's try typing on the back side. So I rolled this receipt into the Royal here, and I was pretty impressed with what I saw. It has a really nice dark imprint, and I typed up this little impromptu prose poem about my evening of going down to the Whataburger and having dinner, and I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. So then the next day I decided, let's go to the neighborhood office supply store and see if I can find just a roll or two of this paper, this 3 1/8 inch wide thermal paper. Well, they have it, but it was in big 6-pack rolls, and I didn't want to spend that much money or buy that much paper, considering that I have other rolls of paper I've never used up. But so I went ahead and came back home and went online on Amazon looking for a small, modest quantity of rolls of 3 1/8 inch wide paper, but again, they're selling it in too big of quantities for my personal use right now. But I did find some 8.5 inch wide thermal fax machine paper, which I went ahead and ordered 2 rolls. And this morning, Sunday morning, there's a knock at the door, and lo and behold, my 2 rolls of Brother brand fax machine paper show up. And so, hey, that's pretty cool. So they came wrapped in plastic film. I went ahead and unwrapped one of the rolls, and here it is. So obviously I came into the idea of doing this years ago from the knowledge that Jack Kerouac, the famous author, had written one of his early drafts of On the Road on a roll of teletype paper. When I first got inspired for the idea of this, I didn't want narrow paper like 3 1/8 or 2 1/4 inch cash register adding machine paper. I wanted something wider. And at the time I was doing a lot of typewriter blogging, and my blog's template is 650 pixels wide for images. And I thought that's roughly about 6 inches wide paper. I would typically typecast on 8.5 inch wide paper with a 6 inch wide column, so that when you scan that and enlarge it to 650 pixels, the letters are big enough to be easily read. Anyways, so I went to the hardware stores and I noticed there's readily available is brown paper rolls 6 inches wide for painting. It's masking paper for painting. I didn't want to type on brown paper just because it's a little too dark for some of the typewriters. They don't give a dark enough impression of ink, and it's just hard to read. I wanted white paper. It took me quite a while. I went online and I found a source, a 3M white 6 inch wide rolls of automotive masking paper for automotive painting. And I went down to my local Napa Auto Parts store in Albuquerque, and I found they had the rolls of these. They were kind of expensive. They're 700-foot rolls of 3M brand automotive masking paper, but they this particular roll, as you can see, the core of it is deformed, and so they sold me this roll for, I think it was like $8. Normally these would have been about $15 a roll. It's really super thin paper, kind of that crisp kind of paper, but I found after using it, and this is probably close to 10 years ago when I started doing this, I had built a little wooden holder for this that would sit in back of the typewriter. But I noticed that this paper is very smooth, and it's not waxy, but it has the kind of a surface, maybe hydrophobic, where it doesn't take ink very well. It tends to be a light impression, and the ink tends to smear on the paper. It doesn't really absorb well into the fibers of the paper, which is probably, if you think about it, that's the kind of paper you would want for masking, for painting. You don't want it to absorb paint into the fibers. You want it to be a barrier. So anyways, I had used this for a while, but obviously I haven't used it in a long time, and I think I've relinquished this roll of paper for my grandkids to draw on, and haven't used it much since. But afterwards, I, of course, continued to be interested in rolls of paper. I did have a roll of this, I don't know how wide this is, probably 12-inch wide tracing paper. And it's very, very thin, translucent tracing paper. You can get this at art supply, drafting supply stores. But it really is, number one, too wide to type on unless you have a wide carriage machine. But even more importantly, it's really too thin to reliably thread through a machine. A lot of times if the rollers on your machine aren't in pristine condition, it just won't thread through a machine very well. So this is kind of out. But I did eventually do some searching online at the suggestion of one of my viewers, looking for teletype paper on Amazon, and I did find a source of teletype paper that's 8.5 inches wide. It is a heavier thickness of paper than the masking paper. It is definitely a different kind of paper. This is like the raggiest newsprint paper you can imagine. It is very, very low-grade rag kind of paper, and it is adequate, certainly, for first draft typing, but it really doesn't take correction tape very well because of the fibrous nature of the surface. The correction tape doesn't want to stick to it very well, so it is okay, but it is not really good for typing on. I was still wanting a better grade of paper, and so that's when I found at my local Staples there's kind of a children's craft kind of a section of Staples. Anyway, they have this poster banner paper. It's artskills.com, and it comes in 17-inch widths. And if you cut this down on a miter saw, which is what I had to do, you cut it down in half, you have two 8.5-inch wide by 50-foot long rolls. Now this particular half, I had made these, put together these little brass fittings so I could hang the roll of paper off the back of the carriage of some of my portable typewriters. Doesn't work for every model of typewriter, but the more universal way of using that paper I found is to get a broom handle dowel and a couple discs of cardboard or foam core, and you can make the width the right length so you can sit it in the scissor legs underneath a folding tray table. And that's how I've been using this paper, and it works really well. But I was still searching for other sources of paper that I come across, and of course this whole saga of the thermal printing paper, I end up, as I said, ordering this 8.5-inch wide fax machine paper. So having described for you the backstory, let's thread the fax machine paper up in the Royal Quiet Deluxe and see how it works. Okay, so what I have here is I have the roll situated like this. So once you thread it in, you have the non-thermal side exposed in the front here. And let's see how this works. Okay. Well, that's pretty good, actually. Move the Coyote over here. Let's take a look at this, shall we? Well, I am pretty impressed with the darkness of of this imprint. And oh, by the way, this is not really an optimal setup for using a roll of paper. I have the paper simply situated behind the typewriter, and you have to have a long leader of paper draped behind the machine in order to accommodate the movement of the carriage back and forth. I think I'll probably go with some other kind of a holder system in the future, like I have in the other examples of this paper roll thing. So I'm going to do some more test typing here. Let's see. What is the frequency, Kenneth? Remember that? Dan Rather? Okay, so let me go get a correction tape cartridge and see how this corrects. Okay, here. It looks like it's adequate. Huh? That looks pretty good. So obviously one of the other problems or issues with using thermal paper is the front side of the paper, which is going to be the back side of your typing, is definitely going to have some black smudges just from the fact that this thermal paper is sensitive to pressure. Pressure creates heat, which turns the paper, the film on the paper darker. So you're going to easily have these smudges and stuff on the back side. And if you leave a page of this laying out in a hot environment, like if you leave it on the dashboard of your car in the summertime in the heat, probably the back side of the paper is all going to turn dark, but hopefully it won't affect the typing side of the paper. So soldering iron, thermal paper. How cool is that, huh? You can even do shading. That's always been an issue with me is using thermal paper, is the fact that the reverse side is going to be heat sensitive. So let's try this same paper on the Underwood Portable. Very cool. Obviously the ribbon on my Royal is a little darker than this ribbon here on the Underwood. And of course the Underwood sits out in my patio room, so this section of the ribbon could be a little bit drier. But anyways, it still has a very good dark, adequately dark imprint, I think. As I compare these two kinds of thermal paper, the Brother fax machine paper versus whatever brand of cash register receipt paper, so they're very similar in color, I would say, in terms of the whiteness of them. They're almost identical. The fax machine paper is a little bit whiter on the reverse side, but the front side, the chemical side of both of these is about the same. I think the major difference, though, I see is the thickness of the paper. Obviously, you might have been able to tell this cash register paper is translucent. You can easily see through it onto the back side, whereas this fax machine paper is definitely a heavier weight of paper. Well, this roll of thermal fax paper weighs 551 grams, which is a little over a pound. As far as the quality of the imprint, though, I think they're both about the same. Actually, as far as the darkness of the imprint, the Brother paper is probably even better, probably because of the thickness of it. They're both great types of paper, I think, as far as using thermal paper as a source of typing on, but there is a couple caveats I would suggest you think about first. The chemical side of the paper is sensitive to both pressure and heat, and you can easily make marks on the paper, so you have to be able to live with that as one of the possibilities when you're using thermal paper for typing on. Now, would you prefer the 8.5 inch or A4 width paper, or would you prefer the narrower stuff? Well, I think for standard writing, probably the fax machine paper is the better choice, only because it's the width of the paper that we're all used to as far as regular sheets of paper. However, I can definitely see the appeal of the 3 1/8 inch wide cash register paper, and I think there's actually 4 inch wide paper, but it's not as common. And that is for kind of a poetry project. You guys might notice when I was typing on this paper here, it is really pretty nice width for an elite size machine, a machine with 12 characters per inch. I think you can get some good poetry written on these kinds of machines because it's wide enough to accommodate those 12 character per inch letters. And I could see if you were like a street poet or something like that, this might be a good, inexpensive way to type poems for people. I don't know if people would be receptive to receiving a poem on this kind of paper. Maybe they would want a higher grade of paper, or maybe you could present their poem in a little folder, a little thing that's a little bit nicer grade of paper. But anyways, I could see there are some utilities or some uses for the narrower paper. But in general, for standard typing, stream of consciousness, creative writing, you're probably going to want the 8.5 inch or the A4 width of thermal fax paper as a choice. Now, one of the other things you might want to think about is, do I order the thermal fax paper, or do I order like the teletype paper, like the raggy newsprint, really low quality teletype paper? Or do I want to get the 17-inch wide banner paper and have to cut it down with a power miter saw? Well, I guess the choice is yours. It really all depends, I think, on the availability. And for me, the only ones that were locally available among those choices was the banner paper. But again, I had to use a power miter saw to cut it down to size. All the other types I had to order online anyways. But I'm going to try using this fax machine paper for a while and see how I like it. Again, I think of it as a very temporary kind of writing, or it's not the kind of paper that you're going to want to write a fancy letter to Aunt Mabel or your loved ones or whatever. It is the kind of paper you would use for personal writing that is maybe first draft writing that you're going to eventually transcribe into something else, some other format. But anyways, this is yet another foray into rolls of paper. Again, this is thermal paper, fax machine paper. If you have availability of individual single rolls of the 3 1/8 inch wide paper, I would suggest, hey, try it out and use it. Myself, I just didn't feel like I wanted to buy 6 rolls of this stuff for a very narrow use, very select use. And here is the holder that I made for the paper roll, or just about any paper roll, my latest iteration. So it simply has a base of wood. This was bought at a craft store. It's like 1/4 inch thick. It's 12 inches wide. I had some 1/2 inch oak pieces, 1/2 inch thick, that I cut a hole in for this rod to fit snugly in. I glued the pieces onto the base and actually used a couple pneumatically driven nails and brads. And then I have a little lip on the front glued on that the rear feet of the typewriter fit on here, and then this keeps the thing from slipping. But basically you just thread this guy on here, and then you can thread the paper onto the typewriter with a loop of paper hanging out behind the machine. And here is how the holder fits on the back of the typewriter. This little lip right here goes in front of the rear legs, and so it sits there. The weight of the typewriter keeps it pressed down, and there's enough clearance back here for the full roll of paper. So there it is. And you have to make sure that you have enough of a liter of paper falling behind your table that will accommodate the movement of the carriage back and forth. Anyway, this is Joe Van Cleve, again with more rolls of paper. Well, you guys stay creative out there, keep typing, and until next time, have yourselves a great day.